Hey guys, with the Elden Ring DLC Shadow of the Erdtree on the horizon, some of you may be picking up the game for the first time or even replaying it. As a longtime FromSoft fan, I decided to make some guides that I think will be useful to new players and even returning players who want to brush up on the details. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the confusing barrage of numbers and turns you encounter on the character creation and status pages. In future episodes, I'll talk about things like how combat works and more, so definitely come back and check those out as they drop. You'll see the same stats and categories on the character creation page as on the status page once you've already created the character, so even though we'll use the latter for our video, this is going to apply to both. I'm going to start with what all these attributes mean. Elden Ring allows you to create a character and customize your playstyle. You articulate this playstyle by distributing investment across a range of attributes. At the beginning of the game, you choose a character type that comes with varying base stats in each category, inclining you initially towards a certain playstyle and giving you certain starting weapons. It's important to note that these do not bind you with respect to how you distribute future attributes, but they do determine where you'll initially be strong and what equipment and gear you'll start with. Ultimately, however, you'll be free to level up these categories however you want, so your starting class will quickly become irrelevant. These attribute categories, however, will remain central to your gameplay, so let's break them down. At the top, you'll see your current overall level. This is just the sum of your levels within each category. Each time you want to level up, you'll need to spend a certain amount of runes, the in-game unit of value. The amount you need to level up is displayed here, and that amount gets higher with each subsequent level. The first subcategory is Vigor. This dictates your health. This is the most essential attribute, especially in early game. You'll take a ton of damage in Elden Ring, so you need to first work towards amping up your health pool to safely absorb that damage. And your total current health pool is indicated right there, and it's also indicated by the red bar that appears on the UI as you play the game. Mind dictates the amount of magic that you have, called FP. When you cast spells or incantations or use special weapons, you'll have to spend magic. The amount you have is finite, and it's determined by how high your mind skill is. If you're aiming to use a lot of spells, you'll want to increase mind. If you're going for a pure melee build, this stat is going to be one of the ones you can largely ignore. Both FP and health or HP, as I said, are finite, but you can replenish them with flasks, and when you rest at sites of grace, they will also be replenished. So they're finite in between resting, so during active gameplay, but not like, overall, or you use it once and it's gone for the rest of the game. Next comes Endurance. Movement and combat use up energy, so does casting spells. You'll usually see this as a green bar on the gameplay screen, but it's over here for your stats. As you make attacks or sprint, you'll see your stamina get used up. That green bar will diminish. When you exhaust your stamina, you will momentarily be unable to attack or dodge or run, leaving you very vulnerable to enemy attacks. It's an important skill to manage. Unlike health and FP, stamina regenerates very soon after you use it up. But the amount of energy you can use before your stamina runs out and needs to regenerate is dictated by your endurance level. Endurance also dictates your maximum weight load, i.e. how much equipment you can carry, and you can see that number reflected right over there. Now here's where things can get a little bit complicated. The rest of these categories deal primarily with damage types. There are usually several ways to approach combat, each linked to a particular skill or attribute. These numbers will dictate two things: which weapons you can use and how much damage you'll do with those weapons. And I'll explain that distinction further in a bit, but let's just start with what the individual categories generally correspond to, although this is, as we'll see, like a little bit murky. Strength is typically for hacking away with heavy weapons and dealing massive damage at the expense of speed and maneuverability. Dexterity is the other form of melee damage. This is more focused on lighter attacks, but moving faster and much more nimbly. So you'll see them typically with weapons that weigh less and move faster, although that's going to come at the expense of raw physical damage. So these two kind of balance each other out. Some weapons or playstyles use both strength and dexterity. Some focus on one at the expense of others. If you watch some of my videos, of gameplay, you'll see that I tend to favor dexterity just because I like the ability to move quickly and, not get caught by enemies as I'm winding up for a really heavy attack. But both playstyles are valid and come with a lot of benefits, but also drawbacks. Now, just as there are two different kinds of physical damage, there are also two different kinds of magical damage. And the distinction here is very idiosyncratic. I mean, you can think of both as just magic, but, Elden Ring and FromSoft in general sort of chooses which kinds of magic they want to call, holy damage and which they want to call intelligence or sorcery. Faith is going to be associated with damage and magic that comes from the spells that tie into the sort of religious mythos of the game. Intelligence is going to refer to what the game categorizes as sorceries. Again, the distinction here is not, objective or intrinsic. It's just what the game has decided is one versus the other. And I'll show you this in a bit, but the way that you can tell is by looking at the spell itself. It's going to tell you if it's a sorcery or if it's a faith incantation. And depending on which one you want to use more, you can level up either intelligence, which is going to correspond to sorcery builds in spells, and faith, which is going to correspond to those incantations. Now, you can see the impact of leveling up these categories in the attack power section over here. Since you can carry 3 weapons in each hand at a time, the amount of damage you do with each is going to be reflected here as right armament and left armament, with the number corresponding to which of those 3 slots the weapon is in. Let's toggle over now to weapons to see the relationship between those stats and the weapons themselves more clearly. Okay, so you can see I currently have equipped the scimitar. Since we just talked about stats, we're going to jump down to the attribute section first. You'll recall I said attributes have 2 aspects: how much damage a weapon does and what weapons you can use. That distinction is reflected here in the attributes required in the attribute scaling. Each weapon will require a certain level in its primary category or categories to use in the first place. This weapon, you can see, requires 7 strength and 13 dexterity. So, if I want to use this weapon, I need to reach that level in both. Every weapon is going to have different requirements to use. Now, these categories are also going to determine how much damage we output, and that's over here in the scaling section. Weapons increase their power or effectiveness as you level up the categories that they draw upon, and how well they do that is given a letter grade. The highest and best is S, and then it goes down from A, B, C to D. So right now we can see that this weapon will increase in power as I level up dexterity and strength, but because it's rated D in both categories, we know that it's not going to increase that much, and that this is sort of a mediocre at best weapon. We're going to be able to see the impact of all of this in the attack power section. When you attack in Elden Ring, your weapon deals damage in different categories: physical, magic, fire, lightning, and holy. You can ignore critical for now. Now, you might be thinking damage is damage, who cares what it's called? And to some extent, you're right, it's all damage, but it's also very important because each enemy is more or less resistant to certain damage types. If you want to know precisely by how much for each individual enemy, you'll basically have to look it up online for the precise numbers, but you can usually figure it out by common sense. If an enemy is covered in heavy armor, for example, you can safely reason that they're going to resist a considerable percentage of physical damage that you deal, whereas they might be weaker to, for example, lightning or magic damage. If an enemy is associated with the Golden Order, which is the main religious faction in the game, you can safely guess that they're going to resist a decent percent of holy damage that you deal. So that's why paying attention to these is really important, and adjusting which weapon you use, kind of toggling based on what enemy you're dealing with, is a key part of playstyle throughout the game. Now, this weapon that we have equipped now, the scimitar, deals physical damage, and you can see that there are two numbers next to it. This actually really confused me at first, but it's actually pretty simple. That first number is intrinsic to the weapon. It's just the natural damage property of the weapon. If I don't do anything to the weapon itself and just level up my stats, that number is not going to change. It's fixed. The number next to it is the additional damage that comes from scaling or leveling up your attributes, which we were just talking about before. So my strength and dexterity levels are contributing an additional 24 points of damage to the power of this weapon. The sum of these two numbers is the total damage output. Here it should be 142 if you add it up, and if we go back to that original status menu in right-hand armament number 2, which is where this is equipped, we should see 142, and lo and behold, we do. If we level up, we're going to see that this change reflected in the number as it rises. And let's do that right now with some runes and just kind of show that. Now, I mentioned that this first number doesn't change if you do nothing to the weapon. However, you can upgrade your weapon itself at a blacksmith, and as you do that, this number will go up. You can see that I've upgraded this weapon twice because it says scimitar +2 for the name. I'll go over how to level up weapons in another video, but just know that there are two ways you can simultaneously raise your damage output. One by leveling up the weapon itself, reflected in this first number, and one by leveling up your stats, reflected in the second number. I think at this point the video is long enough, so we're going to stop here. In my next video, I'll continue diving into these numbers, focusing on all of the ones that deal with defense.